This next session is Meeting Our Climate Moment, Forecast 2040 and Beyond. Thank you to Northrop Grumman and the Ball Corporation for sponsoring this session. And to introduce our panel, we have Christa Peters-Lidard, Deputy Director of Sciences and Exploration Directorate at NASA.
Great, thank you. All right, welcome to our Earth Science focused panel on climate. And I am so pleased to have four amazing panelists that are going to talk about meeting our climate moment from the perspective of NASA, NOAA, Ball Aerospace, and L3 Harris. And I think it's just a wonderful capstone to some of the presentations we've heard earlier in the week, right? So most of you probably heard Kate Calvin's talk about, her role as chief climate scientist. And then of course, yesterday with Steve Volz's talk about a climate ready nation. So building on a weather ready nation to have a climate ready nation. So you've heard a lot about that today, and our panel decided we would not run slides. So you've got a little bit of eye candy behind me, which came from Kate's talk, just to remind you about what temperatures have done over our period of record. But really, I'm going to just introduce our panelists, and we are going to have a nice discussion with some questions and answers, and then we're going to move out to the audience for more questions. So let me just give each panelist an opportunity to introduce themselves. And I think just to make it simple, we'll start and just go down the row. So first we're going to have Karen St Germain.
Hello. Awesome. Good morning. It's still morning, right? Yeah. Okay. Good morning. I'm Karen St Germain. I'm the Director of Earth Science for NASA. And I've been in the job for a little, not quite 2 years, a little more than 1.5 years. The Earth Science program at NASA is, I think, NASA's best kept secret, which is a little sad for me, but still, we are we do end-to-end science to understand the Earth as a system. And that means investing in the technologies, that means fielding missions, funding the research and analysis, and also applications, and all of that rests on an incredible data and information system. So, I think what I'd like to talk about today is just how I think NASA Earth Science fits into the broader ecosystem that's helping us advance our understanding of how the Earth system is changing, how the climate is changing, and why it really matters to keep doing that. I think a lot of people think the science is settled, and it really very much is not. And that's really where I think NASA in particular fits in.
Thank you, Karen. Next, we're going to have Irene Parker from NOAA.
Hi, you guys. My name is Irene Parker. I am the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Systems under NOAA NESDIS. I've been on the job for about 3.5 months. So this is relatively new to me. However, I have been with NOAA for over 15+ years. My love is National Weather Service. I am a fiend of data. And my thought associated with this, if you listen to Steve Volz's presentation yesterday about Climate Ready Nation, to me, we have to really focus on getting ahead into the climate prediction world, and how can we actually integrate our data sets from NOAA, NASA, USGS, international partners, and really push that information, because we have so much of that data, and how can we actually use that to really help in the climate prediction, Climate Ready Nation. So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation about that.
Great. Thanks, Irene. All right, next we'll turn it over to Cory Springer from Ball Aerospace.
Good morning, everybody. First, I just want to say that it kind of looks like industry versus government here, the way we're set up. And I would say that that's really farther from the truth than possible. And that as kind of the theme that I've heard some others talks at this symposium is that, there's really partnerships and teamwork are really, really important. And I think that's one of the things that, I want to emphasize as we have our discussion today. So my role at Ball is I'm the Director of Weather and Environment. And in that role, I work with our business units on Earth remote sensing, operational weather, space weather, and the operational weather even from both civil and DoD. Prior to coming to Ball, I've been at Ball for about 12 years now. I spent about almost 25 years in the Navy as an operational oceanographer meteorologist. So I was a huge consumer of remotely sensed data, which helped me accomplish my mission when I was in the Navy. And I think that perspective is really important. And I'm actually kind of glad that Ball thinks so too, because they haven't got rid of me yet. But from that perspective, for example, I've seen how the measurements of, for instance, ocean surface vector winds can impact operations on an aircraft carrier in so many ways. And that perspective is, I think, really important as we start thinking about next generation systems as we're moving into the future, and how do we meet this, I'll refer to it as an all hands on deck moment, where it really is going to take partnerships to enable us to develop the systems in a manner that's affordable, and that we're developing systems that measure the most important, from space anyway, the most important aspects of the weather and climate enterprise. At Ball, we've done development work, partnering with NASA and DoD and NOAA for decades now. I'll go over like one example of something where we partnered with NASA developing a science mission that we were able to take that technology and turn it into an operational mission. And then we're actually moving on from that as well. But we work very closely with NASA Goddard, developing the NASA JAXA GPM missions, microwave radiometer, microwave imager. We were able to use what we learned developing that system to compete and win the Air Force's, now Space Force, next generation operational weather program called Weather System Follow-On, which its main goals are to measure ocean surface vector winds and tropical cyclone intensity. And by using what we've learned in both of those programs, we're now turning that technology and using kind of our expertise and investing internally, looking at how can we take that technology and put it more in a compact form to help meet some of NOAA's long-term data requirements, like how do we continue the data record of atmospheric sounding into the future in an affordable way. So I'll stop there. I know that this community, what we do impacts things of everyday life, from food security to national security to health to agriculture, and it is really important what we do. And I look forward to answering questions as we move forward.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Cory. So our final panelist is Ann Connor from L3Harris.
Hello, thank you. I appreciate being here today. It's really fun to have the opportunity to be in this panel and have this discussion with all of you this morning. It's a very important conversation. So I lead the civil weather and climate business development for L3Harris, particularly spectral solutions. We spent decades also hand in hand with NASA and NOAA developing weather satellite instrumentation since the very first satellite launched in the 60s, I believe. So I was thinking a little bit about my background and how did I get to here? Because we're talking about a climate moment, and what's my why? Like, why do I even care about what I do? And I spent most of my career government relations, advocacy, policy, really seeing how you shape ideas and make it into policy and then try to implement them as a large organization. And I kind of see that right now with climate, that we've gotten so much information and data from so many different sources. And it's now time to say, okay, well, what do we do with it, right? And that's kind of why I enjoy my job, is because I work with our government customers and others to try to solve some of these problems so that you can make an impact to the individual. Steve mentioned yesterday in his talk about personalizing climate and making it personal to each person. And I think that's where we are a bit with climate data and information. We have the global picture you see above us, But now how do you make it relevant to the individuals where they are? So I'm looking forward to talking more about it with you all.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, that personal story is important. I've got my parents literally just sold their North Myrtle Beach house because of tidal flooding, and it just became untenable. And so that's my personal climate story. And I bet you all have similar experiences we can talk about. So let's talk about the data, because everybody loves data. And so let's talk about what we know from the data that we have today about climate change. So, what have satellites and other assets told us about the current state of climate and how it's been changing? And so let's pass that down the line and hear your thoughts on that.
All right. Well, so it's so we know a lot about not just that the climate is changing. We know a lot about why it's changing, and we know a lot about its distributed effects specifically from satellite data. I mean, the Earth works as a system, of course, and so to really understand and to project future climate change, you really have to understand how that whole system is working. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people think that that science is settled, and we do have a lot of understanding, but what we're also seeing is the system itself, the feedback mechanisms are themselves changing as the climate changes. And those are the kinds of things that we can only really see from satellites, because we need the full global view. So that's really the source of understanding, I think. And it makes it very important to look ahead and ask ourselves, what questions are we going to have to answer 10 years from now, making sure that those inform the systems we're building now, so that we have the data we'll need, again, not just today, but in 10 years, in 15 years, to keep informing.
I'd like to build off of what Karen said. So I agree that it is a global system. And what NOAA's lucky about is that we build off of what NASA has invested in and turns it into an operational data set. But we also have things outside of our satellite world. We have a lot of in situ data, right? We have buoy data. We have our climate network reference. We have all of these, we have so many observations. And what I want to stress is that right now, what we show is very much a retrospective perspective. And then we do a near real-time weather prediction. How do we actually start using the observations we're collecting and go into climate prediction? And I think we have to have, we have these questions that we pose, but we haven't come up with a synchronized, integrated way across industry, across our international partners, just even within our federal agencies, to really see how we can really focus on this climate prediction concept. We know that our oceans are warming. We know with what you heard from Steve yesterday about our $1 billion disaster report, where there's a 4-fold increase in the number of $1 billion disasters that we've had from the 80s to now. Again, that's very much retrospective, which is very important to know. But how do we actually use the observations that we're collecting across our satellite constellations and our in situ observations and make that relevant in the climate prediction aspect? Because I think it's going to help with legislation, actions, policy, changes in how people from a day-to-day perspective behave. And I think that's really key to start really focusing on in the future.
Okay, so I'll pile onto that. I think Karen talked about how satellites are able to provide this global perspective, and that's critical and is one reason why data from satellites has been so important in getting to where we are today. And I thought maybe I'll just give 2 quick examples of kind of another attribute that's really important is kind of long-term data continuity to help us better predict what the future state is going to look like. And probably the best long-term example is Landsat. So for over 50 years, Landsat has provided unimpeachable data of how our land use has changed over the years. It has provided critical data that has supported agriculture, has supported, all kinds of things that are really critical to human societies. The other thing that Landsat has proven, which I think is a really good example of the benefit of satellite data, is the economic impact of this data to nations and communities. And I think, as we move forward, that's really important to recognize because climate and society's ability to understand kind of this whole concept of climate change, it's really hard to get people rallying behind some of the things that we need to do. There clearly is more work to be done than we can all do even together. But being able to focus on those areas that have like high impact to society or people's lives, in a way kind of like what Steve said yesterday, is really important, and maybe one thing to remember and think about as we move forward. So.
And to pile on even further, thank you. Companies like L3Harris or Ball really work hand in hand with the government customer, with the user community, with Weather Service, with the scientists to really come up with what is the best, what are the gaps in the measurements? What do we need in order to help solve these tough problems? And we really get in there and work hand in hand to develop a system that is better and more precise, or perhaps gives you new insights that you weren't expecting. I think, as a weather company, it's easy to talk about the weather. It's harder to know about climate, but climate really is just the compilation of many, many years of weather. And so our weather instruments have become increasingly sophisticated. You've seen the ABI, the Advanced Baseline Imager on GOES, as well as the IR sounder on JPSS. And this information is now being used to also help with the climate prediction. The accuracy and precision of the instruments are stable enough that the timestamp is able to maintain across time. So hopefully in 50 years, we'll have that kind of set of data that we have from Landsat. One thing I wanted to point out about the data is that we talk about how much data that we have, but I really believe we're in a crossroads where we have the data, we have the computer science, we have cloud computing, we have AI, machine learning. There's all of these things that are coming together at the same time that we can really benefit from a cross-discipline approach to how we solve the problems. And so I think that's going to be something that we need to take advantage of right now, as well as increased investments. You see the venture capital community really wanting to invest as well. They see a future in this business. And so I think all of those things together really benefit the whole.
Yeah, that's great. In fact, it segues into one of the next questions. So let's just go there, about what are the gaps in information needs, right? So we sort of know what we know now. What are the things we don't know? And you already mentioned a few things. Do you have other things? I mean, we could start down there and come back up this way. How about that?
Sure. Well, so again, like Karen said, the science isn't decided. We know a lot. I think now it gets down to the individual level. So a lot of gaps that we hear from the user communities are very specific to their location or to their application of the data. And so those gaps are going to be harder and harder to meet for everybody. And I think that's where the private sector really comes to play a good role, is that, there are infinite possibilities and use cases for the data. And so we're able to find the right market in the right time. And I think particularly with climate, you have so many different stakeholders, whether it's the farmer, it's the insurance agents, it's, even investors these days are really paying attention to how companies act on a corporate level. So I think that, it's hard to say there are no gaps at the same time saying there's a a million gaps that we haven't been able to address. So.
Okay, so I guess my kind of former Navy oceanography bias will show through on this, but one area where I think we have some gaps that where it could be really important for both better understanding and prediction of future climate is measurements of the ocean. I think that everyone could agree that the ocean is totally undersampled at this point. There are new technologies that enable us to make observations that we couldn't really make a number of years ago. For instance, I'll just give one example. So if there is an ability to actually penetrate the ocean surface with a space-based system to make measurements of, let's say, something like the ocean mixed layer depth, which would have a huge, almost game-changing impact on our ability to understand how much heat the ocean is actually absorbing, what it's doing to ocean circulation, which so much drives what climate is doing, is an example of something where, again, back to my bias, it also is beneficial to operations as well, would be something that I would highlight as maybe a gap moving forward.
I completely agree with you. So NESDIS is actually realizing our gaps in our observations. We've been very weather centric. And with our new architecture for our future satellite constellation, we're going beyond that. We're working with our partners at Fisheries and NOS to really expand the types of observations we're going to do in our next generation satellites. So I think you've heard about our GeoXO constellation, and that is going to go beyond weather. We're going into instruments in ocean color. We're going into atmospheric composition to help fill those gaps because it's so key. And then on our LEO constellation, we're building off of things that NASA's been doing with PACE for ocean color. We're working with industry to figure out how we can change our cadence for launches instead of having, taking almost 11 to 12 years to build something, get it up to space. How can we learn from industry and what NASA's done with QuickSat and get things out there within 3 years? Because we need those observations, those gaps that we have to fill. We need to be able to get satellites up there quicker. But then from the data side, what I would like to add is, NESDIS is not just satellites, right? We have our information and data services. And one of the things that I'm noticing is that although we have the data and we have the cloud computing and we have the scientists' drive to create more amazing products that are going to help in climate prediction, one of the biggest gaps and hindrances I see is that we do not have a community agreement on data formats that will help us ease that transition into the cloud using the tools of AI and ML and really opening up our data sets for that. So right now, we have things in NetCDF, we have things in Buffer, we have things in Grib, but let's be honest, if you're really using the new technologies of AI and ML, those aren't the formats that are going to help us. So as we plan our next generation satellites across, not just in commercial, but not just in our federal government, but with our partners, we need to figure out how we can tap into formats like XAR. XAR happens to be today's thing, but it might not be tomorrow's. So how can we leverage our instruments that are up in space to be able to dynamically change formats as needed when they come down, or maybe while it's up there? It's something that we need to consider because there's going to constantly be gaps, and technology on the ground will constantly be probably evolving a little bit faster than what's out in space. So how can we have a balance and a leveraging that from the data side? I see that as a big gap, and I hope this community here can help us kind of solve that. We keep doing it in stovepipes. We all feel like we have our best way of doing it. The reality is there is, if we look to the commercial sector that's not in the science area, if you look at Google, you can see them solving these problems a lot quicker than we are. And we should ask ourselves why. And we should be learning from that and not starting from scratch. So one of the things that we've been doing at NOAA, actually we started this while Karen was here with us at NOAA before she went to NASA, is that we partnered with Google with other transaction authority. We're looking at how we can leverage our lightning mapper data from those for fire weather prediction using ML techniques. I think people use AI very nilly-willy and say it's AI, but it's more ML techniques on how to do fire weather prediction, and then how does that affect the atmospheric aspect for air pollution. It's very fascinating, and I just see those gaps that exist, but we're working on filling them.
So I'm going to riff on parts of what everybody said there, and I'm going to talk about two kinds of gaps. The first kind of gap are the observational gaps, and NASA and NOAA are really lucky that we have the decadal process with the National Academy, and we get, you know, some of the best scientific brains in the country digging deep to figure out which questions we should really be going after, and what observations we'd need to get there. So that's really important, and that's the basis of our next round of investments in the Earth System Observatory, and it's directly going after some of these items. You know, for example, our aerosol, cloud, convection, and precipitation observables will help us understand the fundamental feedback between different types of aerosols and how they manifest in terms of clouds and precipitation and climate forcing. So it's just one example, but the Earth System Observatory is that collection of observables that the Academy identified as being critical for addressing questions today and into the future. And we've got to get moving on that. So to Cory's point about the oceans, the Academy didn't specifically call out a new ocean mission, but the first recommendation they made was deliver on the current program of record, which actually includes some really critical ocean missions. We've mentioned a couple of them already. SWAT is another one that will be launching this year, and I think it's going to actually revolutionize physical oceanography, and also give us the first inventory of inland water that we've ever had because of the spatial resolution. So that's going to be a real game changer for us. So going after those observational gaps. The second gap, and it's again building on what Irene and Cory and Ann have already said, is what I'll call a speed gap, right? We need to accelerate both scientific discovery and the transition of that understanding into usable products. And, you know, I'll just say a few weeks ago, I and a number of folks on the NASA team we went to one of the major agriculture annual meeting, met with commodities groups. These are producers and people in agribusiness. And a couple of quotes from that: we live and die by data. We need information. And this came from big producers and family farmers. And second memorable quote was, I run my farm from my phone, right? So, you know, to get to the point about we've actually got to get the information products into a form that is responsive to the need, but also where and when they need it. So that's the other kind of gap I think we have.
Great. All right. Well, so another topic that came up that I'd like to build on is the future, right? So you know, the title of this session is Forecast 2040 and Beyond, right? So what do we know about 2040? How can we better know about 2040? And you know, what are the observations and tools that will help us to understand what we will be facing in 2040 and beyond? So maybe we'll start with Karen on that one.
Great. So I talked a little bit about the observations, and these are for systems that would be coming online and informing that era. Just as important as what we do, though, is how we do it. And you know, Cory opened by mentioning the importance of partnerships. To get to close that second gap, that speed gap, it's going to take all of us. And I mean that along a lot of different dimensions. So it's public and private. And everyone on this panel is, we consider ourselves partners and friends, frankly. And we've all been in the business long enough to understand the magnitude of what's happening. You know, I cut my teeth looking at sea ice 30 plus years ago, right here at Goddard. And, you know, so the changes we've seen are personal. So it's public and private, but it's also international. We're looking, NASA is dramatically increasing our international collaboration. In fact, we just signed a new strategic partnership with ESA. The idea is we've been collaborating for a long time, and I'll call that, you know, we've had headlights, we've looked out and picked missions we could collaborate on, but now we have high beams. We're looking much further out and planning together. And then, you know, I really want to bring in the issue of the diversity and the inclusivity of the community we're going to need to create and foster to tackle all of these questions, because a diverse community, well, frankly, asks better questions. And that's really what I think our business has to be about, is asking the most impactful questions. And that's going to mean we need people coming from different backgrounds, different experiences, and working together in a multidisciplinary way. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Karen. I mean, you know, you look at our decadal survey that you heard about, you know, on Wednesday with the astro decadal, there's an earth decadal, and, you know, the questions that are in there are mostly cross-disciplinary, you know, like how is the water cycle changing and the carbon cycle, and, you know, so those questions are really important, and it takes that community to answer them. So, Irene?
I think for the future, we have to agree that not one organization, public or private, own the concept of climate, and that we all need to work in this partnership aspect of it. One of the things that I'm noticing is that just within this group, we have very tight communications in how we're trying to work through that and articulate to, you know, to Congress, to general public, that we all have to be in it together. So what I had said before, that even NOAA is changing and NESDIS is changing to go beyond the weather focus and really look into how we can use our satellite platforms to really help in getting the appropriate observations for climate prediction. That is it's a big feat. That's a big challenge. If you look at the fact that, you know, we launched our first satellites in the late 50s, and since then and now, we've come a long way in weather, and we've come a long way in space weather. But we have to, I think my biggest challenge and where I see the future going and what my role is to really try to emphasize to Congress, to the public, the importance of letting NESDIS go beyond their weather scope, and really focus on looking at things like ocean color and geo, and looking at atmospheric composition and the greenhouse gas effects that could be seen from our space-based assets. I think that's really important. I also think that the future is a significant partnership with NOAA and NASA, seeing what NASA's doing in tempo, in glimmer, in pace. It's so important to take the work that NASA's been doing and transition that into NOAA's operational space, so we can get those types of observations out 24/7 in an operational capacity. So we're not letting that research fall, like we continue that. I think working with industry and getting and working with them in the future is going to be really key on being able to buy commercial data outside of what we're buying in radio occultation. I think there's a lot of observations that we can partner with commercial that we might be able to get faster and maybe less expensive, and help us in the climate prediction world. So I think it's working across the board, going back to what Karen said, what are the questions we want to answer, and figuring out how we can collaboratively use our resources, which are limited, and use them efficiently and effectively across all of our organizations.
So maybe I'll just hit on like one piece of the partnership and a couple attributes of, and some thoughts on maybe ways to make the partnership between industry and government even more effective for all of us. And so, so one thought is that, especially for long-term data records for the missions to help us better understand the climate system, I think we kind of talked about this before, but it's kind of a combination of continuity missions and new missions. And thinking about how can we get like more bang for the buck as we're moving through here and moving into the future, because as we all have acknowledged, we can't do everything. So I think Ann and I have had this discussion before, but I mean, so for instance, let's look at some of the continuity missions where development of the technologies has been done in a partnership with NASA or with NOAA and industry. And there are observations that we've been making for like long periods of time, and we know that we still want to make them in the future. So for NOAA, for instance, your atmospheric sounding is a good example of a measurement that we know has a huge impact on our numerical weather prediction systems. And we know that from the INSOSA that we're going to continue those measurements into the future. And I would say there are probably some similar climate measurements that NASA has had responsibility for over the years. Is there a way to kind of leverage the attributes of both industry and the government to have like a good mix of how we get to the future state? So for instance, for these continuity missions, is it possible to leverage industry more, because we've been able to field these things successfully in the past, and look at maybe a different model where we can go faster, we can do things that may be more affordable, so we can get more capability on orbit, collecting the data that we know we need in the future. Yet for these new systems and new measurements and new technology, it's clear that we need the leadership from NASA and the government, because in the climate community, we need to have data that people can trust. And we need an organization like the government and NASA to have this broad view of the ecosystem. So we're all aware how all the individual pieces fit together, and has the awareness of what makes sense moving forward. Not saying the industry shouldn't be involved in these new technology developments, because we also, in industry can be quite flexible. We can move at different speeds, but there are ways that it may not be, we often talk about, the options are government funded, government developed, government owned and operated systems, or commercial data services. But I think that there are, and I've heard Karen say this before, there are lots of in between where we can maybe take advantage of some commercial practices, but at the end of the day, we still want to ensure that all these missions that we're developing, that the community can can feel confident that the measurements are the actual measurements that we need to make. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, you'll be able to tell that Cory and I've coordinated. No, but actually I was going to say something similar to what Cory is talking about, and maybe I can just expand on it a little different ways. Alfred Harris, we grew up with NASA. Our instruments have been inextricably developed with NASA and NOAA. The people that work on those instruments have been doing so for 30 years. The culture is within our organization. And to maybe take that next step and trust that the systems and the processes that have been developed over time in partnership with our government customers would be sufficient to then let the reins loose a little bit. I don't know how else to say it, but providing ways for industry to then fill that gap, the time gap, the speed gap, and saying, you know what, you've got the stamp of approval. We know that you have scientific grade data, that we've trusted in this data for a long time. So why don't industry continue to build that? We have confidence that that data will be sound and available, and then spend the resources, like Cory was saying, on the more difficult or new measurements or observations that we don't have that level of confidence or trust in the data quite as of yet, right? And so I think that's a big challenge to meet the climate challenge, is if we're gonna need more data and more information with the same amount of resources, then we should expand on that partnership even more. Yeah, I probably don't need to say more than that. I had a lot of thoughts, but yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and I think those partnerships are one of the opportunities for the future, right? And so I'd like to just build on that and have that be our last question before we send it out into the audience. And that is, what are the opportunities, right? So, and from your perspective, I mean, other than the ones we've mentioned, are there other opportunities, towards this 2040 timeframe that you can see? So let's start with you, Anne.
Sure, thank you. There are other opportunities, and one thing I want to address is that, as a global community trying to address climate change and make changes, you have need for verification, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon trading. There's a lot of opportunities in the future that this data can then be a foundation for policy, for accountability, and for really the private sector even to fill in and be able to help that data. But the government is needed to give it that stamp of approval. Like, this is scientific grade, this is something we can trust. So, the opportunities are endless. I mentioned the private sector can come up with every little different measurement that you need, whether you're a firefighter or a surfer, and you need to figure out how the waves are going to be that day for your sport. So I think the opportunities are actually endless, but to keep it a little more narrow, just more continue the collaboration that we've already had.
So I'll just give one example of something that I see really encouraging, and it's really quite new and interesting, and that is the involvement of NGOs in starting to be interested in measurements that can help with climate predictions. So, for example, the Environmental Defense Fund has a mission called MethaneSat, and MethaneSat will be the first satellite system launched by an NGO and funded by an NGO. Balt's actually on the team. We're helping build the instrument, but it's going to make global measurements of methane, and the data is going to be made transparent, open, and available to anybody that wants it. And it's the Environmental Defense Fund sees methane gas as a huge potential impact that we can actually help change and help do something about. But we need to know where it's coming from, and being able to have global data sets that are open to the public, and being able will help others make decisions on how we can actually maybe capture those rogue emissions, and what we need to do to prevent methane from escaping into the atmosphere, which has a huge impact, especially in the short term, on climate. So that's one thing I think is really exciting moving into the future.
So we have runners with microphones. Do they have questions in the audience? Okay, one online. Okay, or your own, you can do that too. Okay, good. And the next question will be, whose hand is up? Well, the other hand is up. Well, they have to have a microphone. We've taken all their microphones. Do we only have one microphone? We've got, where are the microphones? 1, 2. Maybe Anne and Cory, they have 2. So. Okay, yeah, Anne. All right, well, I will get this. Well, thank you. We'll just, yeah. All right, so the online question.
For the Earth System Observatory, is there already a desired schedule for its formulation phase? Given the United States government budgeting cycle, what are the plans for when the work is to be funded?
Great. So the Earth System Observatory is the collection of the what the Decadal Survey identified as the designated observables and the Earth Explorers. So there's the core observatory and the competed layer, which is the explorers. For the explorers, we're approaching release of an announcement of opportunity for those missions. For the core missions, we have approaching the end of the pre-phase A work and moving through a series of gates associated with the acquisition planning and so forth, the sort of the normal NASA process to move into phase A work. And so we would expect to be moving into phase A later on this fiscal year into next calendar year. So yeah, we're starting.
We had one over here, and we got two here, one there and one there. This guy was first. Yep, right in here. See him?
I don't know.
Next one will be over here.
I don't know how y'all might answer this or not, but watching the rather hypnotic map during this, in your like Cory's thing, we need more data over the oceans. But I look at it and say from the 1880s, it's very precise in the way the yellow and the gray changes over the oceans and the iron. And I'm going all through the century, but it isn't until we really get the satellite data until the 60s, 70s, 80s. And so I'm saying, where's that data coming from that they're so sure of themselves when they put these little blotches here and there, all the Pacific, and what are the data points? And or is it credible to have something do that?
Yeah, so the image that you have been looking at is known as GIS-TEMP. It's produced at the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, which is part of Goddard Space Flight Center. They're located in New York. And they have a series of data points that they use, and essentially they interpolate between those points. So there's buoy data, there's coastal data, and other data that's been very heavily quality controlled. It's all open source, so you can actually go look at the data. And so obviously over time, the data density increases. And so there's more confidence in the regional and small scale changes. But what you're looking at back in the 1880s, I mean, the data networks back then were sparser. So, but that work has been published and scrutinized for decades. And so they do that every year. So every year they release, and actually we work with our partners at NOAA. They also release a temperature map. And they're very consistent. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Christa. Next question is over here.
So this question's for Irene. I think you mentioned that some of the commercial companies, especially ones doing research, even Google, are able to do some of the research extremely fast. And you said you want to catch up with that as well. Can you think of any particular reasons why that might be the case?
So I've been heavily involved in it. And so I can say from my perspective, at least for the past year and a half, we've been doing the Google OTA. It has been the fact that we were able to get all the data in one location. That was the first thing. Once we were able to do that, the tools they had and their scientists know how to use those tools, very much so. And so two things, I guess. One was getting the data all in one location, but there is a knowledge skill set difference between their scientists versus our scientists, at least in the area of AI and ML. And I think that's a knowledge area that we in NOAA, and especially in NESDIS, we just set up the National AI Center. And we are focused on getting our science community and our technologists actually mind melding in that area. We've actually been doing, I think we're in our 3rd AI session of hackathons inside NOAA. We're trying to train up people, but there is a discrepancy in the training aspect for the skill sets.
Here we had one over here.
So this is for all the panelists. I heard a couple of you say we need missions more frequently and we need better data latency. And we've heard this morning about the benefits of ISS and the next generation of space stations. And so I'm wondering if and how there's planning behind the scenes going on to leverage the ISS and these future space stations to fulfill those 2 needs that have been kind of talked about today.
Yeah, I can say that the ISS is an integral part of the Earth Science program. You know, we have several missions on the ISS now. It's a very valuable platform for us for deploying new missions pretty rapidly, testing out new ideas, and so forth. So I view it as one of the really important tools we have in our toolkit. It's not the solution for everything, but this mix of CubeSats, small sats, ISS-based observations, all the way on up to the larger missions. It's that mix of capabilities that I think is really going to address the widest range of needs on the appropriate timescales, right?
Another question over here. Where's the microphone? There you are. Raise your hand up so she can see you. There you are.
So I've been enjoying this meeting for the last 3 days. And one thing that is very different about the participants that I've seen from the last 2 meetings that I've been, that was all on climate, is that there were a lot of people in uniform, NATO generals, really freaking about climate change. And I mean, that's just out of, this is civil, I get that part. But it kind of, and with Steve Vol's commentary yesterday, climate prediction is becoming an integral part of our national security. And so I'm trying to understand, why don't we have Air Force, or they understand this is a threat multiplier. We are seeing climate migration in Central America. We're seeing the situation in Ukraine affecting our food security market. What are we gonna do to attract and ensure, because that's gonna be a way for growth. I'm in a private company now. That's a big way for growth in ensuring that climate and security are central to our success as a nation. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll say a few words and then you may want to add. So you're right. We don't see a lot of those folks in this room today, but I will say, over the last 12 months, I've seen more intensive effort to integrate the national security community with the civil science community than all of the previous years of my career combined. In fact, the National Academy is working hard on this. So you're right; they aren't in this room, but there is an intense amount of activity, and this gets back to the question of the more diverse people, the community of people who are working these questions, the more quickly we're going to be able to ask the right questions and get to impactful answers, right? And when I say impactful answers, what I'm really talking about there is linking what we understand about the physical environment, the carbon cycle, the biological environment, with the interaction, the interaction between humans and that physical environment. And so there are a lot more people working on that now than there were 12 months ago. And I think, but we're still talking about humans, and it's about making connections and building trusted partnerships and so forth. But I think it's well underway.
And with that, we will go ahead and call it almost call it a day. We call it a session. Thank you very much.